Jasmine Crockett, silenced the room. After Stephen Miller said this about black communities. It took 22 seconds to shift the air in the studio, 22 seconds between a smirk and a silence that wrapped itself around the country like a wire tightening. 22 seconds in which a former White House advisor thought he was winning a debate and instead triggered a national reckoning. It began like any other Thursday night panel. Polished intro music, a panoramic shot of the studio cameras panning smoothly across a semicircle of polished politicians. The lower third read, "Closing the Gap, Education in Crisis." But the crisis wasn't the topic. It was sitting at the far end of the table, legs crossed, voice cool, conviction locked and loaded. Stephen Miller leaned back in his chair. Navy suit, red tie, nothing out of place. He had rehearsed the lines. Phrasing designed to sound like concern. Language engineered to strike without bleeding. He knew how to talk about poor communities without ever mentioning race. He'd built a career out of it. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett. Forest green, blazer hair pulled into a neat braided bun, a folder filled with data in her lap, and a calm that didn't need announcing. She looked like she'd come to deliver policy. She knew she'd have to deliver a reckoning. The moderator, Deshaun Briggs, opened the segment with a question meant to ease everyone in. How do we close the achievement gap between rural and urban schools? Safe. Measured. Predictable. Miller smiled first. He started soft like he always did. Something about absenteeism test scores the usual. Another guest, Dr. Tamara Feld, offered insight about outdated textbooks and funding disparities. Jasmine listened. She didn't blink. She was letting him walk. And then Stephen Miller stepped forward, verbally, at least. "I think we have to be honest about the real issue here," he said. His tone was steady, almost bored, like he was discussing the weather. There's a cultural issue in urban communities, a discipline issue. You can pour all the money you want into these schools, but until we reject this entitlement mindset, until we teach responsibility, we're going in circles. There it was, wrapped in a bow, the code, the bait, the hit disguised as help. The studio air stilled. A camera jolted slightly, catching the moment like an accident. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She folded her hands. She turned her head ever so slightly toward him, like a judge who already knew the verdict, but was curious how the accused planned to explain himself. "I want to be clear," she said, voice smooth, as silk stretched over steel. "Are you suggesting that the reason urban schools serving mostly black and brown students are underperforming is because their families lack discipline?" Miller shifted just a fraction. "I'm saying we need to look at root causes, behavior, culture, priorities. We can't keep pretending every problem is external." Jasmine straightened. No eye roll, no sarcasm. Just a breath, a brief surgical pause, and then came the strike. "You want to talk root causes?" she asked, locking eyes with him. And then, calmly, with no script, no drama, she recited what sounded like numbers, but hit like an obituary. "In my district, schools receive just over $200 per student per year. 10 miles away, in a majority white zip code, that number jumps to more than $13,000. Teachers using textbooks from 2004. Ceilings with visible water damage. No school nurse. No music. No sports. But you want to talk about discipline?" She wasn't shouting. She didn't have to. Her tone was measured like a heartbeat under pressure. "Throwing money at the problem doesn't fix it," Miller muttered. Jasmine nodded, not in agreement, but as if to say, "You just proved my point." "I agree," she said. "Because throwing money implies effort. What we've done is starve communities and then blame them for being hungry." Deshaun looked down at his notes. No one else spoke. Even Dr. Feld, who had pages of statistics ready, sat still. Jasmine continued. "You talk about responsibility like it's something people in my community lack. But I represent parents who work 2 jobs and still show up to school board meetings. 14-year-olds walking their siblings home because mom's shift ends at 11. And you call that entitlement? It wasn't anger. It was indictment. Clean. Undeniable. Delivered like a verdict from a courtroom only she had jurisdiction to speak from. The clip, those 22 seconds, would be sliced and re-uploaded within minutes. But in that moment, it wasn't about virality. It was about clarity. About someone finally refusing to let coded language rewrite the pain of entire communities. Miller didn't speak. Not because he didn't have words, but because none of them were designed to withstand someone who came armed with receipts and reality. Jasmine sat still. No smugness, no gloating. Just calm. The kind of calm that shatters narratives and leaves a stain they can't scrub from the edit bay. She didn't move. Not because she was finished, because she was just beginning. The final frame of that 22-second clip wasn't an explosion. It was a still image, Jasmine Crockett, hands folded on the table, eyes unwavering. No smile. No glare. Just the calm of someone who had walked through fire before and learned not to blink when the heat rose. And across from her, Stephen Miller's seat, still warm mouth, just slightly open, caught mid-thought in a moment he couldn't rewrite. What the cameras didn't show, at least not the way the internet would see it hours later, was the stillness that followed. The seconds that stretched into a kind of silence that didn't ask for applause. It demanded attention, the kind of silence that made even the sound engineers forget to breathe. But to understand how Jasmine delivered that moment, you have to rewind. 24 hours earlier, a beige conference room on the 3rd floor of the downtown Sacramento. Marriott was humming with a different kind of tension. Not confrontation, preparation. Jasmine stood at the far end of the room. Her team, Claudine Rodrigo Yvette, was scattered across chairs and tables, empty coffee cups in clusters, laptop chargers draped like caution tape. On the screen at the front, a paused video of Stephen Miller on another broadcast 3 weeks earlier, gesturing smoothly as he said something about failure being normalized in fatherless homes. He wasn't shouting. He never did. That was his weapon. He's going to try that line again tomorrow, Claudine said from the corner, arms crossed. Entitlement, culture, responsibility. It's always the same script. Jasmine didn't turn. Just tapped her pen twice against her notepad. Rodrigo looked up from his phone. He's betting you'll take the bait. Lose your calm? You won't. Jasmine finally turned to them. I don't need to outtalk him. I need him to reveal himself. Claudine raised an eyebrow. And if he doesn't, Jasmine smiled barely. Then I'll do it for him. There was nothing performative about her strategy. No pre-rehearsed zingers. No one-liners tailor-made for TikTok. Just clarity. Just facts. And just enough silence to make every word land with weight. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single line she'd scribbled days earlier, in blue ink. Urban doesn't mean broken. Poor doesn't mean irresponsible. She stared at it a long time. Later that evening, she called her father. He picked up on the second ring, already laughing. Let me guess, baby girl. You about to be on TV again? Jasmine chuckled. Yeah? Tomorrow night. You ready? I think I'm more ready than he is. There was a pause, a warm silence. You know what your grandmama used to say? He added, voice low now. Don't argue with fools, baby. Just tell the truth. People hear it different when it's quiet and solid. That line stayed with her. Not just in her mind, but in her breath, her cadence, her delivery. The next morning, she sat alone in a makeup chair backstage. A soft hum from the fluorescent bulbs above the faint buzz of stage crew outside the door. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, focused still. No memorization, just organization. She opened her folder again, not to rehearse, but to remember. Remember the schools she'd visited where students shared textbooks with pages torn and taped. Remember the mother who cried because her child's cafeteria no longer served hot meals. Remember the 16-year-old who asked her if college was even for people like us. She wasn't going in with a speech. She was going in with them. Yvette entered the room with a water bottle and a soft grin. "You good?" she asked. "I'm ready," Jasmine said. "You want to rehearse your opening again?" Jasmine shook her head and stood. "I'm not going in with an opening. I'm going in with ears." Minutes later, the green room was silent. Miller sat across the room, scrolling his phone like he was checking a scoreboard. He didn't look up. Jasmine didn't speak. She sat directly across from him, unfolded her folder, and began to read. Not loudly. Just enough for him to hear the rhythm of paper turning, the sound of preparation that didn't need an audience. Producers walked in a few minutes later, mics and handheads, ducked in their rush. 10 minutes till showtime, one said. The technician reached to clip her mic. Jasmine nodded politely, thanked them, and adjusted the wire herself. As the last cable was secured, Miller finally looked up. "So," he said, with a practiced smirk, "we're going to be cordial tonight, right?" Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. "I always am." He laughed like he'd just scored a point. But Jasmine wasn't here to play a game. She was here to carry something heavier than ego, something older than insult. She was carrying voices. The mother who stood outside school board meetings, in the cold, waiting to speak. The teacher who'd built a classroom library from garage sale leftovers. The janitor who fixed the heating unit in a high school over winter break, because the district wouldn't. She was carrying them all, and she didn't need to shout to do it. That's what Miller hadn't accounted for. He'd studied her clips, watched old hearings where she clapped back and made headlines. He thought she was reactive. He thought she needed volume to win. But that night she sat with stillness that didn't seek attention. It sought justice. And when the lights went up and the host said, "Let's begin," Jasmine Crockett didn't make a statement. She listened. She let him go first. She let him reveal himself. And when it was her turn, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. She raised the stakes, and he didn't even realize it. When Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, it wasn't with fire or fury. It was with the weight of 1,000 unopened emails from underfunded districts, with the gravity of stories she didn't have to invent because she'd lived them, heard them, carried them. Stephen Miller didn't see it yet. He thought she was just doing what Democrats always did on these panels. Counterpoint deflection data dump. But what he couldn't know, was that Jasmine had come not to argue policy. She had come to indict a system. Quietly, with receipts. And right now she had the floor. "There's a school 10 miles from mine," she said, voice steady. "It gets almost twice the funding. Same state. Same tax structure. But one community is considered deserving. The other is called entitled. That's not an accident. That's a design." Stephen shifted in his seat, trying to wedge himself back into the frame. "I think, but Jasmine didn't stop. She didn't allow interruption to become misdirection. "You know what those kids do," she continued, her tone unwavering. "They share textbooks from before the Obama administration. Some of them held together with rubber bands. They study in hallways because their library was turned into overflow cafeteria space. And still, they show up. Every sentence had the cadence of a hammer striking steel. Every day," she went on, "they walk through metal detectors. They eat lunch that wouldn't pass inspection in most office buildings. They go home and help raise siblings. And you sit here and call it a discipline problem." Miller wasn't smiling anymore. The moderator, Deshaun Briggs, glanced at his note cards like he was trying to find a parachute. But no one was crashing. Jasmine was piloting the moment with complete control. Miller tried to inject some composure. "It's not just about money. It's about priorities. Family structure. Leadership." Jasmine turned her head, slow, deliberate. "Don't shift the goalposts," she said. "You didn't bring up leadership. You said culture. You said behavior. Let's not pretend your language is neutral." Silence. You could feel it in the studio, coiling around the lights and boom mics. Even the cameraman in the back stopped adjusting his frame. Miller opened his mouth again, but this time Jasmine raised her hand just slightly. Not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to signal, not yet. You said personal responsibility, she continued. Let me tell you what that looks like, where I'm from. Parents working 2 jobs, coming home after 11 p.m., still checking homework, still making it to parent-teacher conferences on their day off. That's not entitlement, that's sacrifice. And I'm not going to let you rebrand it as failure. This was no longer a debate, it was testimony. Deshawn looked at her like he was watching someone walk across a tightrope in high winds every step, deliberate every word placed with surgical precision. And then Jasmine leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to signal something was about to land. I brought something, she said, opening her folder. A crisp white page. She held it up, letting the camera catch it. This is from the U.S. Department of Education, she said. 2022 breakdown. It shows majority white districts receive $23 billion more in funding than majority black ones. Not a theory, not a feeling. A fact. She paused. The paper didn't shake in her hand. Do you know what that money buys? Working bathrooms, certified counselors, art programs, functioning heating systems, and you're sitting here wondering why some kids fall behind. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't flustered. She was laying bricks, and behind each one, a decade of frustration. Generations of being told to overcome a problem they didn't create. You ever try running a school where seniors are reading science books from the Bush era, she asked. You ever try teaching algebra in a room where the heater's broken and the windows won't shut? Miller looked away. Not down away. Somewhere to the left of the camera. Somewhere safer. But there was nowhere safe in that room now. Because Jasmine wasn't just correcting a narrative. She was dismantling it, piece by piece, with names, zip codes, and evidence. Dr. Tamara Feld, who'd stayed mostly silent so far, gave a small nod. Not performative, just acknowledgement. Jasmine noticed, but didn't break stride. I'm not saying we don't have work to do, she said. But when you look at a school that's doing the best it can with half the resources, and you call it irresponsible, you're not analyzing the problem. You're excusing it. This time, Deshawn jumped in. Congresswoman Crockett, if you had to name one policy change you believe is most urgent, what would it be? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Equity in funding. Full stop. Her voice was low now, like the volume had dropped just enough to make everyone lean in. You cannot preach personal responsibility while intentionally starving people of the resources they need, and then blaming them for being hungry. Miller looked down, not because he was ashamed, because he'd lost control. He was used to opponents yelling, storming, making it easy to frame them as emotional, unstable, angry. But Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once. And in doing so, she'd flipped the power dynamic. She didn't match his tone. She replaced it. She didn't shout him down. She made the silence do the work. And as the studio lights continued to hum and the cameras captured every breath, every pause, every blink, Jasmine Crockett didn't just dominate a panel. She reframed the entire conversation. But what no one realized, not yet anyway, was that the most defining moment wasn't in the broadcast. It wasn't in the panel. It wasn't under the stage lights or caught by the A-cam. It came after. After the mics were supposed to be cut. After the moderators shook hands and the credits rolled. Because truth doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks in the room, quietly sits down, and waits for the lie to exhale. And when it did, Stephen Miller gave it breath. The segment wrapped at 8:01 p.m. Sharp. A smooth outro, Deshawn's voice steady. Thank you for joining us for this vital discussion on the state of American education. We'll see you next week. The studio lights dimmed just slightly. Not darkness, just transition. Producers moved with practiced swiftness. One reset the cue screens. Another muted the feeds. The sound techs started unhooking microphones with clockwork rhythm. Jasmine Crockett stayed seated, not out of defiance, just presence. Miller, on the other hand, moved with urgency. He reached under his blazer, tugged at the mic pack with a little more force than necessary, the wire yanked out in a single motion. The kind of movement that said, "Get me out of here." But his words lingered. He muttered them under his breath almost casually, as if no one important was around. "This is why nothing ever gets better," he said, stuffing the mic cord into a case. Too much coddling. Not enough accountability. It would have faded into the clutter of post-show cleanup, except the boom tech closest to him hadn't yet powered down. His mic was still hot, still catching audio, still feeding into the board, and the room already tuned to a quiet frequency heard it. Jasmine did too. She didn't raise her head at first, just blinked, slowly, as if letting the weight of those words settle before she responded. Then, with the same deliberate calm she'd used on air, she stood. She didn't approach him. She didn't have to. She just turned enough for her voice to carry. "You know what doesn't get better?" She said loud enough for the crew, the producers, the intern balancing a stack of clipboards near the exit. "Systems where the people making the rules don't have to live by them." Miller froze mid-step. Jasmine didn't stop. "Where someone like you can talk about entire communities you've never had to survive in and then call it accountability." There was no venom in her voice, just gravity. Just a weight that made people stop walking. Made someone in the control room instinctively hit record again. "That's not truth," she finished. "That's cowardice. Dressed in credentials. Hidden behind policy speak. And I won't let it pass." She didn't wait for a response. She turned to a nearby staffer, handed back her notes, like the moment hadn't just shifted the emotional climate in the building, and walked off the set. Miller didn't reply. Couldn't, maybe. The room didn't buzz. It didn't react with shock or gasps. It just paused. It felt like someone had cracked open a vault, and inside was something raw and undeniable. And then someone, no one knows, who cut that entire exchange into a 22-second clip. No music, no intro. Just clean, raw video titled simply "Off-Camera Truth, Jasmine Crockett Checks, Stephen Miller After the Show." By midnight, it had already racked up 2.1 million views. And by dawn, it wasn't just trending. It was moving. Not in the abstract, not in some vague viral sense, but physically, emotionally, through inboxes, private messages, group chats, break rooms, classrooms, kitchen counters. It was being passed from person to person like a note that had to be read now. People didn't just watch it, they leaned into it. They remembered themselves in it. Charlene, a night nurse in Fresno, was standing in front of a vending machine in a dimly lit hallway when her co-worker sent the link. She clicked it while waiting for her tea to warm. Halfway through Jasmine's words, she forgot to sip. When it ended, she didn't realize she'd been holding her breath. Her eyes filled not with sadness, but with something heavier. Recognition. Across the country in Toledo, Ohio, Anthony Green sat on a couch next to his 14-year-old daughter watching the clip. He didn't usually stop for political content, but something about this felt different. Jasmine's last words landed like a line he'd spent years trying to say, but never had the right moment for. He turned to his daughter and whispered, "You hear that? That's what your grandma marched for." In Shreveport, Louisiana, Iris Delgado, a retired public school teacher, watched from her kitchen table, hands clasped tight. 40 years in classrooms without heat, with broken desks, with chalkboards so worn down, you had to write in capital letters just to be seen. She listened to Jasmine and murmured, "Finally?" Someone said it plain. The video didn't just trend, it testified. Young organizers clipped it into TikTok stitches. High school debate teams analyzed it like scripture. Educators played it in class, not as politics, but as language, as advocacy, as proof. One comment read, "This is what professionalism looks like when truth walks in the room." Another, "She didn't yell. She didn't cower. She just told the truth so well the lie couldn't stand up." Ann Miller. His office scrambled. Fast. The full episode hadn't even aired in all time zones, but already he was trending, and not for the reasons he'd hoped. His team put out a press release the next day. 3 paragraphs of standard damage control dressed as concern. Words like mischaracterized, tone, and respectful disagreement peppered through the text. But no one was listening. Because the clip didn't need context. It didn't need commentary. It stood on its own. What Jasmine had done in those quiet moments on air and after was shatter the pattern. No shouting match, no soundbite sparring, no bait and switch. Just the truth. Quiet. Solid. And in doing so, she hadn't just called out one man. She'd given voice to millions. And now they were speaking back. Not in unison, not in slogans, but in a flood of lived experience. What Jasmine Crockett had cracked open in that studio wasn't just Stephen Miller's thin veneer of policy speak. She had pried open a vault, one filled with forgotten stories, unspoken truths, and the kind of pain that had long since gone quiet from exhaustion. The echo was louder than the original. It started small, as these things always do. A teacher in Newark uploaded a video from her classroom, panning across a row of desks, 2 missing, 1 patched with duct tape. A sticky note on the board read, "We ran out of markers, use pencils for now." Then came a school nurse from Tallahassee, posting a TikTok, walking through her office. She narrated softly, "No EpiPens, no backup inhalers. My fridge stopped working last fall. We store insulin in an ice chest now." It ended with her saying, "But yeah, sure. The problem is discipline." Each video tagged with a single word, your off-camera truth. It became a signal, a shorthand for anyone who'd ever been told to be grateful for the bare minimum. For parents who were called uninvolved because they couldn't take off work at 1:30 p.m. for a parent-teacher conference. For students who were marked as disruptive when they dared ask why the library was always locked. For teachers who didn't quit on kids, but who were forced to quit on systems that never backed them. Jasmine didn't reply to the storm. She didn't have to. Her silence wasn't absence, it was strategy. She returned to D.C. quietly, turned down morning show appearances, skipped the reactive interviews, let the moment breathe. Because when you speak the truth with enough clarity, sometimes the smartest move is to get out of the way and let it land. But that didn't mean she wasn't watching. Her team was buzzing. Rodrigo called it a cultural rupture. Claudine called it a policy inflection point. Yvette just called it about damn time. By Sunday night, Jasmine finally sent a message. Just 7 words. "I'll speak Monday. No spin. Just me." The location was deliberate, the steps of a middle school in East Los Angeles. No cable news trucks. No national press corps. Just a scattering of local reporters, a handful of students watching curiously from behind a chain-link fence, and a dozen community organizers who knew this wasn't just a media moment, it was a chance to make it real. She didn't start with a soundbite. She started with a memory. "When I was 10, Jasmine said, standing in front of a single mic on a metal stand, I missed an entire semester of science because our school didn't have a teacher. They sent us to the library with packets and said, 'Be grateful.'" Her voice wasn't angry. It was anchored. "I'm not interested in debating people who've never lived that. I don't care to win arguments with folks who measure progress by how quietly we accept being overlooked." She paused. "I said what I said because it needed to be said, and I'm not taking it back. No applause, just the faint sound of cars behind the school, the rustle of students behind the fence." But let me be clear, she continued. This is not about me versus him. This is not a viral moment. This is about students. It's about equity. And it's about making sure no child in this country has to prove they deserve dignity. That line, prove they deserve dignity, would be on every headline by noon. But Jasmine didn't care. Because just like in the studio, she wasn't there for camera time. She was there to remember aloud what so many had been forced to carry in silence. You can't shame people into silence, she said, voice rising slightly, and then call it professionalism. If the truth makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why not who said it. And then she stepped away from the mic. No press questions, no spin room. She let the silence close in behind her like a door. And she left. But on the other side, the backlash was building. Stephen Miller resurfaced just hours later on a conservative podcast. His tone, usually polished and composed, was visibly sharper now. This, he said, is what happens when we lower standards to accommodate victimhood. It's not my job to make people feel better about their failures. He tried to strike the same chord responsibility. Culture, accountability, but something was off. The words landed flat. Detached. A man trying to reassert control in a conversation that had moved on without him. The host nodded along, but the damage was already done. The comment wasn't a blowback, it was a flare. And across social media, people responded not with rage, but with footage. Footage of school conditions. Teachers walking through hallways lined with buckets to catch rain from a leaking roof. Students practicing instruments with duct-taped keys and broken reeds. Principals showing entire classrooms, sharing one outdated laptop cart, 3 laptops, still functional. One high schooler in Detroit filmed a short clip sitting cross-legged on the floor of his chemistry class. No desks today, he said. They're being repaired. There. All 6 of them. Miller's words accommodating victimhood became the wrong fuel at the wrong time. Because this wasn't just a media storm anymore. It was a reckoning. Not choreographed, not centrally organized. Just the collective weight of unheard people finally being handed a microphone by someone who didn't flinch when she turned it on. Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed grounded. She returned to her district, held 2 town halls, not televised, not live streamed, just cafeteria tables, plastic chairs, and parents who had questions. And Jasmine, she listened. Because sometimes leadership isn't about what you say. It's about how long you're willing to sit still and hear. And that's what made her dangerous, not to people, but to the system. To the idea that only one kind of voice belongs in policymaking. That truth has to be softened to be respectable. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't snapped. She had spoken, and the silence that followed wasn't a pause. It was transformation. Because when silence transforms, it doesn't echo, it resonates. It expands, it sticks. That's what Jasmine Crockett had done. She didn't just leave a mark in that studio or on that podium in East LA. She altered the sound of political truth-telling. Not louder, not harsher, just clearer. And now that clarity was being carried by others. She had sparked a movement by standing still. By the end of the week, something had shifted, not just online, not just in political circles, but in the quiet spaces where change usually begins. Cafeteria tables, where teachers graded late into the night. Break rooms in hospitals and postal depots. Bus stops where mothers waited with half-asleep toddlers, wrapped in scarves, scrolling their phones, and pausing at that clip. The one where someone finally said what everyone else had been forced to bury under politeness and patience. And then it arrived. A letter. Plain envelope. No return address. Postmarked Modesto, California. Carefully folded and handwritten in blue ink. It landed on Jasmine's desk on Thursday evening, just as her staff was packing up. The city outside her office window flickered with the glow of street lamps. The hum of fluorescent lighting in a stubborn old HVAC unit filled the silence. Most of her team had gone home. She sat alone. She opened it slowly, like she already knew it wasn't junk. Inside a single page. Congresswoman Crockett. I watched what you said on TV. Then I watched it again. I'm not much for politics. Haven't voted since Yavor. But I needed to tell you something. My grandson's in 8th grade. He's smart. Loves space math and music. His school has one working microscope in the whole science lab, and he practices on a broken saxophone. Last month, he asked me why his classroom doesn't have enough chairs. I didn't have an answer. When I heard you speak, I felt like someone finally said what I couldn't find the words for. You didn't yell. You didn't talk down. You didn't talk. You just told the truth. Thank you for that. Sincerely, Mrs. Thelma Garcia Jasmine sat still after reading it. Not emotional, not exactly. Just grounded. Anchored by something deeper than all the noise. Over the past week, she'd heard from donors, pundits, and even a few celebrities. Her team had flagged invitations from 5 national networks and 3 podcasts. The White House had even quietly inquired if she'd be open to future visibility. But this letter, this was the one she'd carry, because it wasn't public, it wasn't performative. It was a grandmother in Modesto trying to explain to a child why the system had failed him, and finding relief in finally being seen. Jasmine folded the page gently and placed it into the top drawer of her desk. Right next to a photo of her mother, a woman who had taught elementary school for 31 years. A woman who once patched the holes in her classroom walls with construction paper and prayer. A woman who taught Jasmine that dignity wasn't about titles, it was about what you did with your voice once you had it. Outside, the night rolled on, but something felt steadier. Not solved, not over, but steadier. Because when someone tells the truth clearly, and without apology, it doesn't vanish when the camera's cut off. It sticks. It travels. It passes from voice to voice like a note meant to be carried. And people carried it. In church basements, where congregations paused the bulletin to talk about equity. In classroom circles, where students discuss systemic funding with the fire of personal stake. In city councils and parent boards, where once muted voices found new confidence, echoing Jasmine's line like scripture. You can't preach responsibility while starving people of resources and then blame them for being hungry. It wasn't just a quote. It became a framework. Educators began incorporating the panel into lesson plans. In media, literacy courses, students broke down the rhetorical devices Jasmine had used: calm tempo, strategic pause, factual layering. In law schools, professors replayed the moment as a case study in power dynamics and unflinching testimony. And in high schools across the country, students watched with quiet recognition. Not because she looked like them, though many said she did, but because she spoke like someone who knew what it meant to be overlooked and still keep showing up. The conservative backlash didn't stop. It intensified. Right-wing media labeled her radical. They dissected her tone, called her condescending, combative, disingenuous. One pundit even described her as dangerous, not because she was angry, but because she wasn't. The implication was clear. A black woman telling the truth without flinching wasn't just an anomaly, it was a threat. But Jasmine didn't respond. Not with press releases, not with counter clips. She let the country speak. And speak it did. In Oakland, a high school junior named Terrence posted a photo of his AP biology classroom with the caption, "We're smart. We're not broken. Just underfunded." In New Orleans, a cafeteria worker used her lunch break to film a TikTok 30 seconds, showing food trays, portion sizes, a broken sink, a taped-up refrigerator door. It ended with her staring into the lens and saying simply, "Discipline isn't the problem. Neglect is." By the following Monday, the hashtag off-camera truth had been used over 3.2 million times. But it wasn't the views that mattered. It was what the country was starting to remember. That policy isn't abstract. It lives in hallways with cracked tiles and water-stained ceilings. It sits on plastic chairs, missing a leg. It whispers in the silence after a child asks, "Why don't we have what they have?" And Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for them. She handed them the mic, not to speak for her, to speak with her. And as the noise began to settle, a new sound emerged, quiet but resolute. The sound of truth spoken plainly. The kind of truth that doesn't need to be screamed to be heard. Because clarity, when delivered with care and conviction, carries farther than outrage. And when it comes from a place of lived experience, it becomes something more than a headline or a hot take. It becomes evidence. That's what Jasmine Crockett left behind in that studio, and what the country chose to carry forward. Not a debate, a declaration.